June 6, 1944, 03:10 in the morning. The English Channel was black, except where steel caught strayed light and flashed for an instant like a knife. The sea slapped the hulls of landing craft with a cold, methodical violence. Diesel fumes hung low over the water. Men sat shoulder to shoulder in wet gear, knees pressed against packs, rifles, entrenching tools, Bangalore torpedoes, canteens, ammunition bandoliers. Somewhere in that crush, beneath canvas, metal, and salt, a small rectangle pressed against cloth and bone, a chocolate ration bar dense as a brick, bitter as duty, silent in a breast pocket, while the greatest amphibious invasion in history moved toward France. Before dawn, the invasion was still only sound the grinding of engines, the clank of gear, the muttered sickness of men fighting the sea before they ever met the enemy. Then the horizon began to pale, and history opened its jaw. That small chocolate bar matters because D-Day was never only a story of courage. It was a story of arithmetic, foresight, packaging, shipping, calories, and the strange power of a democracy that could turn breakfast into strategy. Operation Overlord required not merely brave men, but a civilization able to move their food, fuel, ammunition, and vehicles across water under fire, and keep doing it after the first shock had passed. General Eisenhower's simple decision: okay, we'll go, set in motion more than 7,000 naval vessels, including roughly 4,000 landing craft and 1,200 warships. That same night, 822 aircraft carried and towed airborne forces into Normandy. By the end of the day, nearly 160,000 Allied troops had landed, and by the end of June, more than 850,000 troops, 570,000 tons of supplies, and nearly 150,000 vehicles had crossed into France. The invasion was a military assault, but it was also a moving continent. To a German soldier looking west from the bunkers and bluffs of Normandy, the first expectation was simple. The men coming ashore would be heavy with weapons and fear, stripped down to the bare necessities of survival. That was how war often looked in Europe. By 1944, scarcity, dressed in uniform, improvisation mistaken for endurance, logistics treated as the dull servant of battle rather than its hidden master. An invasion force, in the German imagination, might be violent, reckless, even mechanically impressive. But it would still be human in the old European sense, hungry, dependent on luck, living moment to moment under strain. The first wave, above all, should have been fragile. It should have come ashore carrying bullets, not comfort, grenades, not variety, emergency sustenance, not the machinery of regular feeding. Men thrown onto hostile sand were expected to arrive already beginning the slow decline that hunger always begins. That assumption had roots deeper than Normandy. Long before 1944, German observers had cultivated a certain contempt for the American military character. In a report compiled after the First World War, Germans had described the United States as a money-hunting nation, too absorbed in comfort to make a serious army. One former Prussian official dismissed the American army as a mob, pure and simple. Others were bewildered by the way American officers behaved toward enlisted men. A German observer admitted that in his own army, officers treated their men as cattle, while another conceded that the cordial relations between the officers and men in the American army compensated for what Europeans read as a lack of iron discipline. The old European suspicion was clear. Democracy might make men loud, free, informal, even physically impressive, but not hard in the proper military sense. Normandy would test that prejudice against the weight of material reality. The American answer to that reality sat in cardboard and tin. The U.S. Army had built an entire language of operational feeding before the invasion ever began. Field Ration C was designed as a stable, nutritionally balanced combat ration that could provide a soldier 3 full meals a day. One early 6-can set contained 4,437 calories. Field Ration D was emergency concentration made edible, a chocolate bar of sugar, dry milk, cacao fat, oat flour, and flavoring, 600 calories to a bar, meant to keep a man alive when everything else failed. Then, there was the K ration, the one most closely tied to the assault itself. The quartermaster history described it as the answer to the need for an easy-to-carry ration for assault and combat operations, compact enough for battle, varied enough to sustain a man for the short, violent window it was designed to cover. Breakfast, dinner, supper-soluble coffee, sugar, biscuits, canned meat, bouillon, lemon powder, gum, dextrose tablets, sausage, and always some form of morale disguised as nutrition. It was intended for 2 or 3 days, not for a campaign without end. That limitation itself reveals the confidence behind it. The Americans planned not merely to land, but to establish the flow that would relieve the assault ration almost immediately. So when the title says that U.S. troops landed with full rations on D-Day, it does not mean linen tablecloths on Omaha Beach. It means something much more formidable. It means that even in the first violent phase of the invasion, American troops arrived inside a system. Their food was not an afterthought. It had been measured, packed, standardized, and attached to the body of the soldier as deliberately as ammunition. In the invasion itself, individual field rations of the K and D type were used, with other combat rations following in the days after. The assault wave did not come ashore as a mob scavenging for the next meal. It came as the forward edge of an industrial organism that had already thought about the second day, the third day, and the road beyond the beaches. That difference is easy to miss if one looks only at gunfire. It becomes impossible to miss once one notices the chocolate bar. And what a strange symbol it was. The D ration bar was deliberately made unromantic. The Smithsonian preserves the story with almost comic severity. The War Department worked with manufacturers to produce a bar that could survive extreme temperatures and provide dense energy. And Quartermaster Officer Paul Logan had insisted in 1937 that it should taste a little better than a boiled potato. Not delicious, not tempting, not a luxury to be devoured in one sitting. It was designed to resist pleasure so that it could serve necessity. Yet in that unlovely object lived an extraordinary idea. A free society that had mastered excess in peacetime could discipline even chocolate for war and then ship it across an ocean in unimaginable numbers. The bar in an American pocket was not sweetness. It was organized abundance stripped to its military essence. Picture the crossing from the American side of the ramp. A man is seasick, another is silent, another checks the fastening on his life belt for the fourth time. Spray hits faces already smeared with soot and anticipation. The landing craft bucks. Somebody's hand goes to ammunition, then to the front of the jacket, not to eat, not yet, but to confirm by touch that the ration is still there. It is a small instinct, almost childish. The body wants reassurance that the world still contains sequence. If there is a bar in the pocket, if there is coffee in the packet, if there are biscuits wrapped against damp, then somewhere beyond the machine gun fire, there's still noon. Still evening, still tomorrow. This is how armies truly move, not only by orders from above, but by the tiny private evidences that life remains arranged. Tapu Kramanth at Utah and Omaha, especially Omaha, planning struck the wall of reality. Men plunged into deep water, dropped under the weight of gear, lost weapons, lost direction, lost brothers. The bombardment had not destroyed enough. The beach obstacles were still there. The bluffs were still alive. At Omaha, the casualties in the assault echelons were terrible. By nightfall, more than 34,000 Americans had nevertheless come ashore there. And across Normandy, the Allies had suffered over 10,300 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. The figures are always almost too large to feel. So history narrows again to smaller things: a wet rifle sling, sand sticking to blood, a helmet filling with water, a man flattening himself behind a steel obstacle while shells struck the tide around him. And tucked among all of that, absurd and stubborn, the ration remained flattened perhaps, soaked perhaps, but carried into battle because someone far from the beach had insisted that combat did not cancel the human need to be fed. For the Germans, that detail could feel almost insulting. They had prepared for an invasion of men. What they were meeting was a system. Fire could kill the soldier in front of them, but behind him stood the packing plant, the shipyard, the quartermaster laboratory, the warehouse ledger, the rail schedule, the bakery, the cannery, the port commander, the truck company. The doctrine of nourishment itself. A German defender might have expected the American first wave to arrive stripped to desperation. Instead, the American assault troops carried the evidence that the men behind them expected them to continue existing. That is a profound military statement. Ammunition says, fight now. A ration says, you are expected to survive long enough to need another meal. An army that invades with rations invades with continuity. In European war, ideology was often discussed in the grand language of speeches, flags, and frontiers, but ideology is also hidden inside logistics. The German system prized obedience, hierarchy, severity, the visible distance between officer and enlisted man. American military culture, though hardly egalitarian in any modern sense, still carried a habit that startled Europeans: The soldier was not simply used. He was provisioned as a participant in a national machine that needed him healthy, fueled, and moving. German observers had once mocked American informality and the lack of aristocratic polish among officers. Yet those same observers admitted that the relation between officers and men was different, less feudal, more human. In war, that difference can be abstract until one notices who carries coffee, sugar, gum, biscuits, and an emergency chocolate bar into the first morning of invasion. The K ration itself was almost a miniature republic of needs. Its components looked trivial when viewed one by one. A packet of soluble coffee, a can of veal loaf or ham spread, bouillon cubes, lemon powder, biscuits, gum, sugar, a sausage, dextrose tablets, cigarettes, in some packs, toilet paper. None of these items would stop an MG-42. None would breach wire or silence artillery. But together, they represented a doctrine. The soldier is not fed only when the battle is over. He is fed so the battle can be endured. The quartermaster historians later admitted that the K ration became unpopular largely because it was misused and kept in service too long. That admission matters. It tells us that the Americans did not mistake assault feeding for a permanent solution. Even before the beachhead was secure, they were already thinking about replacement, improvement, flow, and the return of something closer to regularity. To understand why this would have unsettled German perception, one must remember how much of Europe by 1944 had become a geography of substitutes and reduction. In the medical history of the war, U.S. Army physicians recorded conditions in German captivity so severe that breakfast could be nothing more than ersatz coffee lunch, a ladle of thin vegetable soup and bread meat, only in tiny amounts perhaps once a week, with hunger so constant that men bartered cigarettes for food. Those particular observations came from the nightmare of prison conditions, not from every frontline Wehrmacht mess, but they reveal something larger about the world Nazi war had created, a continent narrowed by extraction, shortage, and habitually diminished life. Against that backdrop, the American ration carried into France was not merely sustenance. It was the material expression of a civilization that had not yet collapsed into scarcity. This is where the emotional contrast sharpens. German propaganda had trained many soldiers to expect Americans as soft men of money, over-civilized, loud, overfed, technically impressive, but morally shallow. What some of them met instead was more confusing. Men indeed well supplied, sometimes astonishingly so, yet willing to walk into concentrated fire carrying that abundance on their own backs. The old European military mind could understand hardship. It could even admire fanaticism. What it struggled to interpret was a democracy that could produce comfort at scale and then ask comfortable men to die without surrendering the habits of provision that comfort had made possible. The chocolate bar in the pocket was therefore not evidence of softness. It was evidence that industrial plenty and battlefield hardness were no longer opposites. On the beaches and inland in the first days, the American soldier's relationship to food remained brutally practical. K rations were not feast boxes. C rations, which followed in broader use, were often cold, repetitive, and disliked. Even the Red Ball Express drivers later remembered the bland diet of hash, stew, or beans, always cold, and some wired secretion tins to their exhaust manifolds to warm them while driving. There is nothing glamorous in that, but glamour is not the point. The point is supply continuity. A single U.S. division in 1944 required 35 tons of field rations per day. 35 tons every day, merely to keep one division fed. This is the scale hidden behind one chocolate bar. It is the unseen convoy behind the pocket-sized symbol. U.S. By late summer, when the beachhead had become a drive across France, the proof expanded beyond the shore. The Red Ball Express would haul more than 412,000 tons of supplies in 82 days, peaking at around 9,000 tons a day. Truck drivers worked until the blackout lights on the road drove you blind, as one veteran recalled, and one contemporary account praised them with grim admiration. They got supplies to the front, and if necessary, died with their hands on their wheels. Those supplies were fuel and ammunition, yes, but also rations. The Americans did not stop feeding the war once the beach was won. They accelerated it. D-Day was not remarkable because men had food in their pockets. It was remarkable because that pocket ration was the first note in a logistics symphony that would not stop. Now return to the morning itself. Imagine a German observer after the first shock, looking over abandoned equipment, over captured stores, over the debris that washed in with the dead and the living. He would have understood weapons. He would have understood explosives, demolition gear, signal equipment. But there is something psychologically disorienting about finding proof that the enemy came not only to attack, but to remain fed while doing it. Gum, sugar, coffee, wrapped biscuits, concentrated chocolate. In another army, these would be luxuries postponed until the rear area. In the American invasion, they were built into the assault. The message, whether anyone voiced it or not, was mercilessly clear. This landing was not a gamble made by desperate men. It was an appointment kept by a wealthy, organized power that had brought its own continuity with it. And that continuity altered perception. German respect for American material strength had existed before Normandy, but respect is not the same as comprehension. It is one thing to know that the United States has factories. It is another to see how those factories enter battle. German soldiers had long inhabited systems where scarcity sharpened authority and want disciplined the body. American abundance seemed, from a distance, morally suspicious. Yet abundance under arms became a form of authority all its own. It suggested reserves, replacement, resilience. It implied a rear area so deep that the front might remain terrible without becoming starved. When Europeans in earlier years remarked with surprise that American soldiers complained when food was bad, or that they behaved with a freedom alien to old world armies, they were glimpsing part of the same truth. The American way of war carried civilian expectations into uniform, and then backed those expectations with industrial capacity. There is a temptation in war storytelling to separate bullets from bread, heroism from administration, sacrifice from packaging. D-Day destroys that separation. A nation that wishes to free a continent must first know how to pack a meal so that it survives salt water, rough handling, temperature swings, and the panic of combat. It must know how to calculate caloric needs under stress. It must know how to turn farms, factories, chemistry, shipping, accounting, and command into one coherent gesture, the U.S. Army's own medical historians later observed, with a touch of national pride, that Americans were often considered the best-fed people in the world, and that enormous effort had gone into ration issue and menu planning during the war. That sentence can sound bureaucratic until one remembers what it looked like at H-hour. Not paperwork, but a human being on a surf-torn beach carrying proof that someone had planned for his next meal even while others were trying to kill him. The chocolate bar returns here because symbols grow stronger when they survive contradiction. It was not sweet in any ordinary sense. It was designed to be hard, durable, resistant, and only barely pleasant. A little better than a boiled potato. Yet it remains the perfect emblem of American abundance in war, because abundance did not arrive at Normandy as indulgence. It arrived disciplined. Democratic prosperity had learned to compress itself into a ration bar, a can, a packet, a scheduled delivery, a port operation, a convoy route. It had learned to obey without ceasing to be plentiful. The bar in the pocket was therefore not simply food. It was a piece of the American home front, made military industry, chemistry, packaging, calories, and confidence reduced to a palm-sized object that could survive the surf. There is also a moral contrast that runs beneath the material one. In old hierarchical armies, the enlisted man is often treated as something to be spent. In mass democracies, he is also spent. War is never innocent, but he is spent differently. He is counted, studied, provisioned, medically measured, and returned to the machine, not because the machine is humane, but because it is expansive enough to require the preservation of human function. This is not sentiment, it is doctrine. The soldier's stomach becomes an object of strategic concern. The quartermaster, the nutrition officer, the transport corps driver, the dock worker, the food scientist all become silent participants in the same assault. The German soldier confronting that system may still despise it, may still resist it, may still kill and be killed with courage. But he can no longer dismiss it as superficial. That is why events like this change ideology, not overnight and not always consciously, but through accumulation. A Wehrmacht defender might endure the artillery, curse the aircraft, fear the naval guns, and still imagine that war remained at heart a contest of will. Then he would watch American forces remain supplied after the beach, remain fed in the bocage, remain mobile in breakout, remain provisioned in pursuit. He would see that will itself had become inseparable from logistics. He would begin to understand that democracy, for all its the chocolate would have been dense, stubborn, imperfect. It would not have tasted of triumph. It would have tasted of function. Yet to eat it was to participate in something vast, to consume not merely calories, but assurance planning, and the promise that one's army had not forgotten the ancient truth that a man under fire is still a man with a stomach, a pulse, a need for sequence and time. Morning, noon, evening, breakfast, dinner, supper. Even war cannot erase that order. It can only test whether a civilization is powerful enough to preserve it. So the Germans could believe many things on D-Day. They could believe in firepower. They could believe in ships. They could believe in the courage of paratroopers and the terror of naval bombardment. What became harder to believe was something quieter, that the Americans had crossed the channel carrying not just weapons, but an entire philosophy of sustaining life in battle. That they had landed not as men already shrinking into privation, but as the armed edge of a nation so materially deep that even its first wave carried rations arranged in advance. That small fact, almost embarrassing in its domesticity, pointed to the larger catastrophe facing the Reich. It was not merely fighting soldiers, it was fighting a civilization of production, calculation, and replenishment. In the end, the chocolate bar tells the truth better than the speeches do. Hard, plain, unsentimental, deliberately poise and looseness could generate an obedience deeper than parade ground stiffness. Obedience from factories, roads, port schedules, standardized containers, and millions of civilians who would never see Normandy, but whose labor arrived there anyway. By the end of the month, the transformation was measurable. The Allies had not merely survived the landing, they had built a foothold robust enough to receive a flood of men, vehicles, and supplies on a scale that dwarfed ordinary military imagination. The beach was no longer a beach. It was a mouth swallowing whole divisions and exhaling them inland. The American soldier's ration, once a personal object in a wet pocket, became part of a continental circulation. From the perspective of German strategy, this was devastating. It meant that the Atlantic Wall had not faced a raid, nor even simply an invasion, but the first pulse of an inexhaustible transfer of organized power. And still the script returns to the individual, because history only becomes human there. Somewhere in Normandy, a soldier finally broke the seal on that bar, perhaps not on the beach itself, perhaps later in a hedgerow lane, after the first impossible hours had passed, and the body began to understand what the mind had postponed. Restrained, it was made to endure heat, shock, delay, and hunger. So was the army that carried it, and behind that army stood a society that, for all its contradictions, could convert abundance into discipline without first converting its people into subjects. That is why the image lingers, a man stepping into machine gun fire with a ration in his pocket. Not because it is quaint, but because it reveals what freedom can look like when forced to fight. Not luxury, not ease, not innocence, but the stubborn refusal to let war reduce human beings entirely to appetite and fear. A pocket-sized meal on a killing shore, a bitter square of chocolate, a democracy condensed,